And once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Los Angeles Birders webinar for tonight. We have a wonderful program coming up, but before we get to that program, I just want to thank everyone who is a member of Los Angeles Birders. LA Birders is an all-volunteer nonprofit organization, and all of your donations and memberships go into lab and supporting labs, programs and trips and other events. And some of those wonderful things that you support are live and recorded webinars, our student learning opportunities and scholarships, our field trips, community science opportunities, paying to keep the lights on Zoom, things like that. So thank you, thank you, thank you very much for being a lab member. And if you're not a lab member, if you're watching this on YouTube, please consider being a lab member. It's not expensive, and it gives you a nice, warm, fuzzy feeling and makes you feel as you become a part of the community, and we really appreciate it. Next, please. And with that, I would like to introduce Adrian, who will introduce our speaker for tonight. Adrian.
Thanks, Ron. We are delighted to welcome Diego Blanco back for the second installment of his webinar series on the evolutionary history of birds. Tonight's presentation will delve into the fascinating world of passerines, exploring their evolutionary history and biogeography. Diego is a graduate of Cornell University from the class of 2022 and currently serves as a research technician at the Moore Lab of Zoology. In his role, he contributes to the lab's groundbreaking 3D modeling project, prepares bird specimens, and leads both campus birdwalks and tours of the lab. Tonight, Diego will continue his engaging exploration of the evolutionary and biogeographical intricacies of the passerine family. He will delve into how passerines, the most diverse group of birds, have adapted and diversified over millions of years, spreading to nearly every corner of the globe. By examining their evolutionary pathways and geographic distribution, Diego will shed light on the processes that have shaped this remarkable avian group. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Diego Blanco.
Well, thank you so much, Adrian, for that introduction. And I would like to express how happy I am to finally be giving this presentation after it was initially scheduled for a couple months back. But that interim period has given me lots of time to refine this. So without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay.
It looks great.
Any interference at the top right? Do you see my Zoom bar?
I do not.
Okay, fantastic. All right. Well, similarly to how my last webinar was an overview of the diversity that we have in theropod dinosaurs, including the closest relatives of birds, today's webinar is going to be a similar tour through the phylogeny of the passerine birds. Now, passeriforms are, like Adrian said, the most diverse of the bird orders that we have around today. And in fact, most of the information that I sourced for this presentation came from a paper called Earth History in the Passerine Superradiation by Oliveros and many other authors that was published in 2019. So what this is meant to be is a comprehensive but not exhaustive tour of the phylogeny with an emphasis on the distribution and the origins of all the different passerine clades. So I think when most people think of birds, they think of passerines. Maybe not us who know about things like charadriforms and gruiforms and all these other fancy, names for different groups of birds. But probably in the public's imagination, the most stereotypical image, maybe archetypal image of a bird is probably a passerine bird. They represent some 6,000 species out of the 10,000, 11,000, give or take. That number is kind of always changing with new taxonomic splits that are coming about. But what I want to convey to you all today is an overview and one hypothesis about the relationships between all of these birds. again, when you're dealing with phylogeny, it's never set in stone. All of these hypotheses about which birds are most closely related to other groups of birds and the story of how they came to occupy different parts of the globe is based on genetic evidence, and it's based on what we have at our disposal from the different resources, the different sources of information, whether that's the fossil record or comparing the genes in birds. And given that I do have a penchant for prehistory, I want to start all the way at the beginning. Now, out of black nothingness in the void came the Eocene period. Now, around 47 million years ago, this is what the Earth looked like. And the Eocene period stretched from about 56 million years ago to around 33.9, about 34 million years ago. And this was a time in Earth's history when it's almost kind of like an uncanny valley between the strange alien ecosystems of the Mesozoic and the more familiar ones that we have today. Overall, the terrestrial fauna of Earth was starting to become dominated by mammals at this point. You know, the dinosaurs had their heyday, with the obvious exception of birds. And most of those big terrestrial niches were being occupied by mammals. But at the same time, we have a huge diversification of birds that goes on right around 47 million years ago. So that's smack dab right in the middle of the Eocene period. And the world at this time, again, had some similarities to ours, but some important differences. Some of the continents were positioned differently than they are now. The great southern continent of Gondwana had begun to break up and separate these land masses that had once been joined together. So Antarctica, Africa, South America, all of Oceania, Australia, that was all one continent prior to the beginning of the Eocene, and that was Gondwana. Now, the evidence of this unified landmass can be found in all sorts of different places, from plants to bird distributions. There are plants that their closest relative, you know, plants that are found in southern South America, in Chile and Argentina, and their closest relatives are in Australia or southern Africa. And these aren't instances of dispersal across oceans in the case of the plants. It's evidence that these continents were once linked together. And over time, they broke apart and led to these populations of different species being more or less marooned on all these different continents. Now, to set the scene for the world that these birds inhabited when they were first starting to diversify, the passerines and their earliest ancestors, I think there's two main things that we want to know about the Earth at this time. The first is, again, that breaking up of the continents, but most importantly, the isolation of Antarctica from Australia, Africa, and South America. Now, when Australia, South America, and Africa broke away from Antarctica, that landmass that had previously kept all these warm ocean currents flowing around Antarctica suddenly was gone. And so what you have is the establishment of what's called the circumpolar current. And that circumpolar current is largely responsible for making Antarctica into the, you know, frozen desert that we have today. In the past, prior to the Eocene, maybe even at the beginning of the Eocene, which will lead me to my second point about what I want to key you guys into about the Earth at this time. But at the beginning of the Eocene and before, our Antarctica was a steaming, tropical, hot climate, just like many other parts of the world during the Eocene. But once the continents broke up and established that flow of cold water all the way around Antarctica, that kicked off a period of cooling, which turned Antarctica into ice and lowered the global temperature overall. So the beginning of the Eocene was one of the hottest periods in Earth's history. People have described it as a hothouse climate. You have steaming tropical jungles. You've got all these really rich ecosystems that are, you know, thriving in this really warm climate. But by the end of the Eocene, you switch to an entirely different pole. That, no pun intended, the separation of Antarctica at the southern pole created that current and drove a whole global trend of cooling and glaciation in the southern hemisphere. So why don't we take a look at one of these terrestrial ecosystems that was around at the beginning of the Eocene, when passerine birds were first starting to diverge from their closest relatives. Now, this is an illustration of a site in Germany known as the Messel Pit. And the Messel Pit shares some things in common with other fossil sites that preserve really, really high quality fossils. Excuse me, I believe the term is Lagerstätten. It's a German word, so I don't know the pronunciation entirely on that. But I've always heard it as Lagerstätten. And a Lagerstätten is a preservational environment that records really, really fine detail. We touched on this last time in my previous webinar with the fossils in northeastern China. Now we're in Germany. And around 47 million years ago in Germany, you had an ecosystem that looked like this. Over here, we've got some early relatives of horses, and we've already got some storks. And back here, way in the back, is someone who we'll come back to later, one of the star charismatic megafauna of the time, a bird called Gastornis. But one of the advantages of this really, really fine detail of preservation that you get in lacustrine or lake environments is these beautiful fossils that we have here. So we've got this animal in the top left, Macrocranion. This was a small mammal of obscure phylogenetic relation. I don't know the mammal phylogeny here. On the bottom here, we've got Darwinius massillae. That's an early primate. And in the middle, this is even a testament to just how well that preservation can work. This is a jewel beetle, and the structural color of its wings, its elytra, is still preserved in the fossil today. So we've got shrimp, we've got fish, we've got spiders, we've even got this gigantic snake called Eoconstrictor fisheri. And what all these fossils show is that they paint a picture of a whole complete ecosystem. We have pollen, we have every trophic level, and in the midst of all that are the birds. So beyond just the ancestors of passerine birds, we've got ancestors or relatives of trogons, like this Masilla in the middle. We've got Primozygodactylus in the bottom left. That's one of the early stem members of the group that includes passerines. And then this Messalornis at the top right is Messalornis, isn't it? My screen is blocking it. But this Messalornis at the top right is one of the most common bird fossils found in the Messel Pit. And it was related to rails and cranes, people think. And again, it shows that this was a wetland environment. Now, I want to take a detour to point out one of my favorite birds from prehistory, which is the skull that you see at the bottom right. That belongs to Gastornis gaisalensis. And I chose this illustration by the talented Gabriel Ugueto to give a sense of the environment that the earliest ancestors of passerines were flying around in. These birds, Gastornis, were, huge. I don't actually know how tall they could get, but I think it's, around 7 to 8 feet. Clearly flightless. They were frugivores, but I'm sure they would have snapped up whatever was in their path. And they were relatives of the fowl. So the clade that we call Galloanceres, that includes the pheasants, partridges, grouse on the one hand, the galliforms, and then on the other hand, the anseriforms, the ducks and geese. So we've also got some other early mammals, some Dissacus. This is I think it's a mesonychid, which is actually an early relative of hoofed mammals. And then some Plesiodapus up here. But I digress. Let's go back to the birds. On the bottom left there, we've got Primozygodactylus yunjue. And this bird was, again, one of the many animals flying around in the Messel at the time. But it's the first bird that we can trace its lineage to the passerines. It's one of the earliest ancestors of the group that includes passerines today. Now, as I go through all of these different branches of the family tree of passerine birds, and again, their closest relatives, I've made these little maps that show the distribution of all the members of that taxon. So I'm going clade by clade. And again, maybe it helps to do a little bit of a refresher on phylogeny. When we talk about phylogeny, we're talking about monophyletic groups. So I'll go back to this slide, but here's an example of a phylogeny. And this area highlighted in the blue square there, that's a monophyletic group. So all of these brackets, if you can trace any of these two tips back to one common ancestor without including anybody from a different, more earlier common ancestor, that's a monophyletic group. So they don't all have rankings like family or subfamily or superfamily. That's all kind of, at your discretion what you want to rank those as. But the point being is that they are units of evolutionary diversity. They are a group of organisms that are more closely related to each other than to any other organisms, on that family tree around them. So as we go through the whole Passerine phylogeny, we'll be using these little diagrams here to show both the distribution and the evolutionary relationships between the taxa that we're dealing with. Now, if you'll notice, there's colors on the cladogram on the phylogeny itself, the tree. These orange lines here correspond to all of these different color codes for the continent. So orange is Australia and Oceania, New Zealand, all those Pacific islands. Yellow is Eurasia and Northern Africa. Green is Southern Africa. This what would you call that? Light blue, cyan, turquoise. That's South America, with the exception of just the very northern end here. And we'll get to that when we talk about the broadbills, the old world broadbills. And then this purple up here is North America. So as you go, I've marked all of these different cladograms with these colors to indicate where a lineage originated, where their earliest ancestors diverged from their nearest relatives, and then subsequently where they dispersed to throughout the history of that group. So the first stop on our tour is this, Eufalconomorphae. Now I've trimmed some of the tips of this tree out because there are all sorts of extinct birds that fit somewhere into this tree, but they're not quite the focus of what we're talking today. Things like that Primozygodactylus and the ones we're about to see in the next slide. But the point being, passerines are part of a group that includes falcons and parrots. So it was certainly within the time that I was interested in birds that the study came out or the research came out that showed that falcons are close to parrots. But what I hadn't known before this was that parrots were pretty close to passerines. In fact, they're the sister group to passerine birds. And if you look at some of the fossil ancestors of this group, you can see that they share some similarities with both falcons, parrots, and passerines. So this is an animal, the biggest one here depicted on the slide. That's an animal called Mesolaster gratulator. And the skull is that smaller inset to the left. And this is the next finest group within that previous Eufalconomorphae. So within the blue rectangle there, this is a clade that we call Psittacopasseres. So we're excluding falcons here, but you can see some of the resemblance that these earliest ancestors of passerines and parrots had to falcons. And given their morphology, given what we know about anatomy, scientists hypothesized that these were predatory birds. So the ancestor of falcons, parrots, and passerines was likely a predatory bird. There's another one here, Halcyornis toliapicus, similarly predatory. And the diverse ecologies and lifestyles that passerines evolved were something that they came to on their own. They didn't inherit it from their ancestor, which was a predatory bird. So let's split that group up a little further. Again, Psittacopasseri includes the psittaciforms and the passeriforms. So I've chosen two representative species here. These two have the names of the species on the slides, but not all of them have that. So the important thing to pay attention to is the groups that we have delineated here. So this orange bar around 55 million years ago describes the split between the psittaciforms, the parrots, and the passeriforms, the perching birds. So around 55 million years ago is when passerines split off from the parrots. And in both of these cases, the parrots and the passerines at this time, they were probably originating somewhere around Eurasia. This is not quite the Australian origin that we see for some of the later groups of passerines. This is the split that takes place that includes parrots too. So this took place somewhere in Eurasia, we think. But as we go further, we can select this passeriforms and then go in a little closer here. Now, these distributions, the maps here, show the current distribution of all the extant species in that group. Now, passeriforms include three main lineages. On each of these introductory slides, I've got one representative from each of the main lineages that are going to be in the clade that we go into deeper as we progress down the phylogeny. And the passeriforms, the true passeriforms, the ones that we have around today and their most recent common ancestors, they did originate in Australia. So what does the phylogeny of this earliest branch look like? On the one hand, we've got the outgroup to all the rest of the passeriforms, which are the New Zealand wrens. And they are represented by two species that are found on the North and South Island of New Zealand. And again, as you can see on this map here, they're restricted to that Australia and New Zealand bioregion. Further down the tree, we've got the two main groups of passerine birds. What we call the eupasseres, or true passerines, include the tyranni on the one hand, or also known as the subausines, and the passeri on the other, which are also known as the aucenes. So this is the basalmost split. This is the main two categories that we have within passeriforms. Everything else that we get to today is going to be part of one of these two major groups, because the New Zealand wrens just kind of stand on their own. And I have selected a couple pictures for you to see just up close what they look like. They're very interesting birds. But one thing that sort of puzzles me is, if this is the earliest branch on the passerine tree that's alive today, then we must be missing some steps that take us back to those ancestors that looked a little bit intermediate between the parrots and the falcons. Clearly, by this time, passerines have already evolved the morphology and the body plan that we associate with them today. They've got narrow bills, they've got, short little bodies, and they look, for the most part, as we expect a passerine bird to look. But within those two groups that we've got after that, the tyranni and the passeri, we have on the one hand the tyranni, which are the flycatchers and their relatives, and on the other hand, the passeri, which are the blackbirds, warblers, finches, sparrows, and their relatives. So here's an outline of the global distribution of those eupasseres. And as you can see, they occupy every corner of the globe. There is not one habitat, save for maybe the cold, barren, rocky slopes of Antarctica, that the passerines have not colonized. As we tour the group today, we are going to see a huge range of evolutionary specializations and adaptations that make them so well suited to their environment. And we'll talk a little bit about how that helped each of the lineages colonize new areas and why certain lineages survived while others didn't. So we've got a representative of two of the main groups. We've got I think this is an umbrella bird up here, a member of the Cotingidae, which is in that tyranni group. And then down here, we've got a member of the passeri group. And these did have their origin in Australia, as evidenced by that distribution of the first branch, the Acanthisidae, the New Zealand wrens, which is still limited to Australia. Okay, so let's split those two main groups, the tyranni and passeri, up a little more. As we go through, we're just going to keep splitting and splitting and splitting, and we might come back and split some more. So the two main groups of tyranni are the Eurylamides and the tyrannides. So on the one hand, the Eurylamides, those are broadbills and their relatives. They're primarily Old World birds, but they have one enigmatic exception to that, which we will get to. You can see the North America / Northern South America icon is colored in there. So there's one aberrant member of that family that does occur in Northern South America. But on the other hand, you have the flycatchers and their relatives, the tyrannides. Now, this is an exclusively New World radiation of birds, but when they split from their closest relatives, the Eurylamides, that split took place around 39 million years ago in Eurasia. So this bar here indicates that the ancestors of both of these groups were found in Eurasia, the yellow bar, but each one of them subsequently diversified in one of these regions. Green goes to Africa, and this purple goes to North and South America. So as we go down the passeri tree, which is this other second branch of the eupasseres, we've got some of the most familiar birds that we know. The earliest branch includes the lyrebirds and their relatives, as evidenced by this nice Albert's lyrebird here, which again are restricted to Australia. And you can see that all of these groups had their subsequent origins in Australia. So Australia and the nearby land masses was really the hotspot for early diversification of passerine birds. There have been some studies and some speculation that have ventured that the reason that song evolved in passerines at all was because the habitats of Australia were so sparse and defending territory was such an important part of, propagating your species, that song became a great way to do that. And that was the selective pressure that drove the evolution of complex song, which is only found in this Oscine group, the Passerine. So these are the true songbirds. The Tyranni, the suboscines, have different anatomy of their vocal apparatus that give them different sound producing capabilities. So they don't sing like the Oscines do. And those common names, the suboscines and the Oscines, refer to that distinction in their vocal anatomy. So the earliest branching members of this Oscine clade include things like, the lyrebirds, the bowerbirds, the honey eaters, the pseudo-babblers, and they are all restricted to, again, that one biogeographic region, Australia and nearby land masses. But once you get down here to the corvides and the passerides, which again are two groups that are nested within this Oscines tree, these are the ones that really did the hard work of colonizing every continent that there is. These two radiations, the corvides and the passerides, are the ones that really became global in their distribution. And as we go and examine their splits in depth, we'll see the sequential distribution of each one of these lineages throughout geography and throughout time. So to keep track of where we are chronologically, these splits occurred at the earliest 44 million years ago, squarely in the Eocene. But as we go down 38, 36, 33, 31, 30 million years ago, we are hitting the Oligocene. So the Oligocene is the next period after the Eocene, and it's spun from around 34 million years ago to around 23 million years ago. So that's where a lot of the diversification of these later groups takes place, is within that geological epoch, the Oligocene. And this was a much colder world than the Eocene, and it involved a lot more glaciation and changing environments that potentially drove the speciation of all these different groups. Now, one of the conclusions that this study that I referenced for this talk made was that it's very hard, if not impossible, to tie the diversification of these lineages to specific geological events. There have been attempts to link them to, specific instances of glaciation, or, the opening or closing of a strait, a strait being, the water that separates what were two previously separated land masses from one another. The closing of that strait would join them together. So the most, famous in this context is Paleo Strait, an old body of water that doesn't exist anymore, called the Turgai Strait, which essentially sectioned off Europe from Asia. So despite all of these seemingly, these barriers that would seem to be congenial to diversifying, it's not so cut and dry. We can't quite pin each of the diversification events in these lineages to specific geological events. Now, that's not to say that a good argument can't be made for any of those things having an impact, and I'm sure that they did. But what I'm going to present to you here today is just a simple look at where these birds are found and in what order they occupied or colonized these different continents. So let's begin with taking a closer look at the Tyranni. Oops. There we go. Okay, so the Tyranni originated in Eurasia, but they came to occupy a global distribution. And we have two representatives here, a royal flycatcher on the top and one of the African broadbills on the bottom. So if we go back to this tree, and I'm going to keep going back to this tree so that we can get a sense, keep our bearings, so to speak, about where we are in this phylogeny. So the next group within that is the Eurylamides, and this is a group that includes things like the old world broadbills, the pittas, the true pittas, and these strange little birds called acides down here. And on the bottom right, we have a bird called Sapayoa enigma. And this is a bird that mystified ornithologists for a long time because it's a South American bird. You can see over here that this northern tip of South America is included in this one bioregion over here. And that distribution is represented by this one species, Sapayoa. And all of its relatives are old world species. None of its relatives are found anywhere near it in time. or in space. But genetically, they're very close together. So how did this one bird that descends from a family of old world birds uh, come to be stranded over here in northern South America? Well, the thinking is that in the past, these birds were a lot more wide ranging, and that perhaps this is just one relic of that former distribution that they had. So here we go within the Euryalamides. We have at the top a clade that includes Euryalamidae itself. And I think some of my fonts got a little bit moved around. But if you can read that, the white text on the white cloud background, it says Euryalamidae. And these are the old world broadbills. And up over here, we've got Phyllopididae, which are called acides or sunbird acides, and they're found in Africa. So although the group originated around 29 million years ago in Eurasia, the first split happened in Africa. So these two branches diverged from one another in Africa, and then subsequently, this lineage down here that includes the Calyptomenidae, the Sapoioidae, and the Pididae went and colonized different regions. So first it was Eurasia over here, and then finally the Pididae went back to Australia, and the Sapoioa is over here in North America. Okay, so back to the Eupacers. The next group within that is the Tyrannides, and we'll take a closer look at those two. So the Tyrannides are primarily a New World group of birds. They are in North and South America, in fact, exclusively in North and South America. And they include such familiar species as the Furnariids, the ovenbirds of South and Central America, and the flycatchers, the tyrant flycatchers. So the clade is named after the tyrant flycatchers. And I find in trying to understand, or at least wrap your head around this diversity, it's good to pick a few anchor points. So you can think of the Tyrannides as the group that includes, the tyrant flycatchers and everything that's more like them than it is like anything else. So they originated in North America, but then spread to South America. And the split between the two main groups within the Tyrannides, the Furnariids and the Tyrannids, occurred around 35 million years ago in North America. And these two families both subsequently colonized South America after that. So again, they're not really families. When I say families, I mean that as in they are closely related to one another, more so than they are to anything else. But it's not to say that these are represented by single families, which in some cases these clades are. But if we take a look at one of these groups, the Furnariids, this opens up a whole host of pretty well-known South American birds. So this is a South American radiation, and it includes birds like tapaculos, ant shrikes, ant pittas, Furnariids, the ovenbirds, wren thrushes, crescent chests, and all these tropical birds that, you're crouching in the cloud forest somewhere to try and get a look at. So again, having their images all here together, once we start getting into the more diverse groups that include, more than 3 different lineages within them, it's cool to see how each one of these different groups bears a little bit of resemblance to one another. So back to that point of, or back to that idea of thinking about things in terms of anchor points, anchor taxa. For me, I tend to think of the ovenbirds, the Furnariids, like this guy right here, as the anchor point for this group. Something that came into my head many, many times as I was putting these slides together was the idea that, certain clades are just weird members of a familiar group of birds. So I like to describe these as just, weird ovenbirds because they're all sort of variations on that theme. And here we have that variation cataloged. So the first split, and again, reading this cladogram, this phylogenetic tree from left to right, each one of these groups that draw back to a common ancestor, it's not to say that one of these, and I'm pointing like you can see me pointing, but each of these birds are equally closely related to the outgroup and to these other groups as they are, as any of the others in that group are. So everything within this monophyletic clade is basically one unit, and you can think of it that way. Just because these ant shrikes at Thamnophilidae are, spatially on this slide closer to, something like the Tapaculos, the Rhinocryptidae over here, does not mean that they are more closely related. What you're paying attention to is the branching pattern. So from left to right, everything downstream of one of these horizontal lines is a single evolutionary unit. Okay, so we've got a split that separates these crescent chests up here, the Melanopariidae, from the I think these are called gnat wrens, the Conopophagidae, and the Thamnophilidae, the ant shrikes. And then over here, the sister lineage to that includes the Grallariidae, the ant pittas, the Rhinocryptidae, the Tapaculos, and the Furnariidae, and finally the Formicariidae, or the ant thrushes. So the Furnariids are probably, some of the most well-known members of this group. They span all sorts of different ecological niches, from this wood creeper here with a long bill to the ovenbird that you saw on the previous slide. They have got a whole range of adaptations that are suited to help them thrive in their environment. And one of the behaviors that they do that they're most well known for is constructing clay nests. That's why they're called ovenbirds, not to be confused with the ovenbird of North America, which is a parulid and way down in this tree, which we'll get to at the very end. But they are, in Spanish, they're called horneros, and that again just means bird that builds an oven. So they've got these clay-shaped nests that I think was on one of the previous slides. Yeah, it's this one here. That they lay their eggs in there. Okay. So we're going to zoom back out for a bit and look at this Tyrannids group again, and we're going to follow the next path down here, the Tyrannids. So this is a group that originated around North and South America. We don't quite know which of those two was the origin. I think from what I gleaned from the paper, it was North America was probably the more likely origin. But this is a group of birds that includes everything from cotingas, umbrella birds, manakins, all the way to tyrant flycatchers. So here's the phylogeny laid out. And you can see they descended from birds that were in North America, as evidenced by this purple line right here, but they are an exclusively South American radiation. So this was the group of birds that first colonized South America from this lineage, the Passerines, and they spread into a whole variety of different morphologies and lifestyles. So the manakins up here, the Pipridae, they have elaborate displays. They have they're even cooperative displays, as I'm sure some of you have seen the videos of mannequins dancing together like that. We've got the Cotingidae as the next group to branch off. And there's the capuchin bird representing the family here. But the Cotingids also include, the birds that are called cotingas, but, things like the umbrella birds too. So that classic jungle sound effect, the screaming peahaw, I believe that's a Cotingid. Sounds like that. Down here, we've got the Titiridae, or Titiridae. And the Titiridae, one of the more familiar members is the rose-throated Bacard that you can see in the southern United States, southeastern. And finally, over here, we've got a group that includes the royal flycatchers and their relatives, so the ones that we saw back on that previous slide that had that crazy display on top of its head there, and the tyrannid flycatchers. So for me, the tyrannids are the anchor point for this Tyrannida group. I like to think of these as the relatives of flycatchers. And a theme that you'll see throughout all of these different radiations is that our birds that we sort of, take for granted that we see all the time actually are the descendants and are the relatives of lineages that, come from far-flung places and oftentimes look many different from the ones that we've come to know and get familiar with here in North America. So the tyrannid flycatchers, that family Tyrannidae, includes, all of the tyrant flycatchers we've got in North America, our local black phoebes, the Pontopus that we'll be looking at the next webinar, and lots of other South American species as well. But they themselves are a variation on a theme that began with the manakins and the cotingas and the titirids and the royal flycatchers. So they share that evolutionary history with them. And if we look at the times that these splits are taking place, we go from 24 million years ago at the earliest split, which is in the Oligocene, to 23.5, 23, 22. And these are all approximate dates that I took from the paper, Earth History and the Passerine Superradiation. That study actually made some progress on many of the previous phylogenies that were done on passerines by including fossil calibrations. So we do have fossil evidence of many of these groups, not just the distant ancestors of both parrots and passerines, but some of the ones that are actually nested well within the passerine radiation. So by assigning these fossils to one of these groups nested within the passerines and then dating them based on the layers of rock that they're in, the authors of this study were able to basically set checkpoints for the origins of different lineages within that. So as far as I know, it's among the most up-to-date references on the timing of the diversification of passerines. And this latest split here, the 22 million years ago, takes us right into the beginning of the Miocene, which is the latest or the next period after the Oligocene. So in the Cenozoic, which is the era after the Mesozoic, there are three periods, the Paleogene, Neogene, and Quaternary, and those are further subdivided into the Paleocene, which was first immediately right after the dinosaurs, the Eocene, which is where our story started, the Oligocene, which came next, the Miocene, which was after that, and then finally the Pliocene, which was right before the very famous Pleistocene, where you have pretty much all of these lineages assuming more or less their modern day form. So by the time people with sharp sticks were chasing after mammoths in North America, the passerines had attained, pretty much the diversity that we have today. Okay, to go back to look at this Eupasseres group, we're going to choose the second branch on that and split this up further. So this is the Passeri lineage, and this contains the vast majority of species in Passeridae. Now, I did not put tallies of all the different families and species that are contained with this group because there are so many of them that it was just, kind of hard to amalgamate all of that information into one place. But suffice to say that this Passeri group that's highlighted in the blue box here is doing most of the heavy lifting for sheer numbers in this group that give that, that order Passeriformes, which includes everything here, that title of the most diverse avian radiation. Okay, so the Passeri include some of the most familiar bird families, the warblers, the blackbirds, the sparrows, the finches, which actually themselves are pretty closely related, and then a lot of these other sort of less familiar birds to us, but in other parts of the world, I'm sure this one of these green catbirds, which is in the bowerbird family, is pretty familiar to someone in Australia. And they originated in Australia, but clearly they've come to occupy a global distribution. Okay. So we are going to skip each one of these successive branches down here because they only contain a few families. And if I had stopped to split each one of these individual groups up, this would be a much longer presentation than I think we have time for today. So with that being said, I'm going to focus on these two main groups right here. The jays and their relatives, the corvides, and the warblers and their relatives, the passerides. So these are two really important sister groups that contain a whole lot of bird diversity that we'll get into. The split between these two clades happened around 30 million years ago, and it happened in Australia. So from these two lineages, we get, basically the two main categories of passerine birds. The jays and their relatives, the crows, the shrikes, and all their relatives, and then on the other hand, the warblers and the blackbirds and the finches and the sparrows, etc. So let's take a look just at this corvides group for now. So The genetic evidence and the fossil evidence indicates that they also originated in Australia and then came to occupy global distribution. But here we start to see some really strange birds that we might not think of being so closely related to crows. So clearly, the most familiar taxon within this group are the New World crows and jays. So again, a helpful starting place for understanding this diversity is thinking of these things all as weird variations on a crow. Um, We've got this bird of paradise down here. I think this is an Astrapia. And I regret not putting the species names on here, but this guy over here is a wattled plowbill, part of a monotypic family. And then I think this is a cuckoo shrike. And we've got this guy down here, which has I think like an Afrikaans name, which I can't remember. But here's the diversity within the group. So the earliest branch right here, around 25 million years ago, uh, split the quail thrushes and jewel babblers away from the rest, and that again is a Australia and Oceania radiation. These quail thrushes and jewel babblers are really beautiful birds. They're mostly found, I think, in Southeast Asia and Australia nowadays, and they are the basal most. So the first branching group of the lineage that includes crows and their immediate relatives down here. So again, crows evolved from a bird that looked more or less like this quail thrush over here, and this is a jewel babbler, but the quail thrushes are related. Now, the next split that we've got here is the cuckoo shrikes, the Campophagidae. Now, that's just one family, just like the Cinclosomatidae is one family. That was around 23 million years ago. This is an old world radiation. But down here, we've got the Satellas and their relatives split off around 23 million years ago, as represented by this Papuan Satella. And there are a couple families in there, but again, we're not going to go split each one of those individually. What I do want to point you towards, and I'm realizing now that this map is obscuring the name of the vireos and their relatives, the Orioloideae, but don't worry, we'll see that name lots of times as we go through this presentation. But what I want to point your attention to are what we call superfamilies. So, anything that ends in IDAE, that's one family of birds that includes a set of genera, a genus and a species. You have multiple, the plural of genuses, I know it is genera. You could also say genuses. But those units of evolutionary classification, obviously are stacked up within the families. And these groups include many families. The superfamilies are, again, the most diverse radiations within this Corvides group. And again, there's not quite a name for the rank that name Corvides occupies. I've heard some sources call it a parv order, meaning it includes, or it's a partition of an order, and maybe that's a useful word, maybe it's not. But again, this is a monophyletic group. These are each other's closest relatives. So now here is kind of the fun part. You get to see the family history and notice the family resemblance between some of the birds that we have in our local environment. So the vireos and their closest relatives, that's the Orioloideae, blocked by the map there. But vireos, as it turns out, are pretty closely related to the old world orioles, which can look as divergent as this dark-throated oriole here. And that superfamily occupies a global distribution. And so does the Corvoideae, the other superfamily, but the Vangas and their relatives, the Malaconotoideae, they are only in the old world too. So let's split it up further. We'll start with the Orioloideae. So another lineage that originated in Australia, but came to occupy global distribution. We've got this whole selection of birds right here. We've got the plowbill again up on the top. We've got this member of the Virionidae over here, and here are the family names. So within the Orioloideae, we've got the Sophodidae. That was the first split over here at 22 million years ago, and they are distributed in Australia. And then around 22 million years ago, we have another split, the Eulacostomatidae or Elastistomatidae, the plowbill, which I believe is only in New Zealand. And then we've got this group over here that split off 19 million years ago that includes the Falconculidae and the Oreoicidae. I don't have the common names on here, but I believe these are called titchrikes, and these are berry hunters. I could be wrong about that, but take the family names at face value, Oreoicidae and Falconculidae. Again, both of those are restricted to Australia and surrounding land masses. Now, the next split happened around 21 million years ago. Again, now we're in the Miocene, so two epochs away from the Eocene where we began. And this is the group that includes the vireos and their close relatives, and then this family over here, the Paramythiidae. So the Paramythiidae is restricted to Australia, but now here we have an instance of dispersal. So the Virionidae, that family originated in Eurasia. This orange bar here is to indicate that their ancestors were coming from Australia, but just in this lineage right here, one of these birds made it across the ocean all the way to Eurasia over here, and then diversified into a whole group of birds that occupy Eurasia, Northern Africa, and then North and South America over here. As an aside, that's why I picked this background. It's a picture, I think, of the Solomon Islands. But, this is the kind of environment that these birds would have been finding themselves in as they were dispersing to new continents. In the Eocene, the continents were still closer to each other than they are now, so it was easier to get across the ocean, hopping along these archipelagos and making it to, a strange and faraway land. So I like to picture, that this background here was the view of some ancient ancestor of one of our passerine birds as they flew to a new continent. Okay, back to the corvides. So we just did this, the vireos and their relatives, the Oreoloideae. Let's pick another group, the Malaconotoideae. So the Malaconotoideae, previously in older classifications, these were grouped together with shrikes, but they actually group out a little farther out. So they're not so closely related to shrikes, which are actually more closely related to crows. But again, another instance of an Australian origin for this group. And we've got, as part of this group, the wood swallows and butcher birds, the Artamidae, represented by this guy here. And we've got these wattle eyes and the Bornean bristlehead, which is the only member of its family. And here are the splits. So the first split within this group happened around 19 million years ago. So you can see these are starting to get more and more recent. The Machirorhynchidae, I think these are called boatbills, was the first group to split off from the group that would eventually give rise to the Vongas, the bristlehead over here, and the wood swallows, so the Artamidae. Now, the wood swallows are the family of birds that include the Australian magpies. Many of you probably already know this, but the Australian magpies are not closely related to the New World magpies, which are in the Corvoideae subfamily, not the Malaconotoideae subfamily. So they are an example of maybe a little bit of convergent evolution, maybe a little bit of shared ancestry, making them come out looking a little similar, but they are not, as closely related as they were previously thought to be, or maybe as their common names might imply. So all these other families, the Ragologidae, the Platysteridae, they also represent dispersal events to different continents. So while the Ragologidae is still in Australia here, and when you see the distinction between just an orange bar here and then multiple colors here, that's to say that the group originated in Australia, but then came to occupy this distribution that includes Eurasia too. The Platysteridae, I believe those are the wattle eyes. They are restricted to Africa, but they descend from birds that originated in Eurasia, as evidenced by this yellow color to the cladogram there. And then the Vongidae are, a pretty well-known family of birds among birders because they contain some pretty crazy looking birds, like the helmet vanga of Madagascar. And they had a radiation in Madagascar that led to them occupying a lot of niches that were not being filled by other birds. So, things like the wood creepers weren't there, regular creepers, which, again, share a common name with wood creepers, but they're not closely related. And all these different ecological niches that weren't being occupied by other birds on Madagascar, the vangids, the vangas, came to occupy. So they have a whole range of really interesting morphology. And then finally, 16 million years ago, we've got this split that includes all these these two nodes here, the Malaconodidae, the Agathinidae, and the Pteriacidae. So Malaconodidae is just in Africa, Agathinidae is in Eurasia, and so is Pteriacidae. And these icons, the country icons, just indicate the broad biogeographical region. This Bornean bristlehead, Pteriacidae, is only found in Borneo, not in Siberia, as you might think looking at them. Okay, back to the corvids. Final subfamily, the Corvoideae. Now, this is the group that includes crows and their closest relatives, their sister taxa, all descended from their most recent common ancestor is where I was going with that. But again, an origin in Australia, surprise, surprise. But this is really one that has one superfamily that has come to, occupy such a wide range of different habitats across the world. We've got a selection of species here, and I will show you the phylogeny again. Now, I picked all of these different illustrations, which, by the way, all come from the Birds of the World website. I've tried to include the little copyright at the bottom left there, but I figured this is for, just general public consumption. I'm not trying to lift any of these images, but they are fantastic resources for picturing the diversity. And the reason I picked all these different species is because you can kind of get a sense of how they're all variations on a crow. The Corvidae is this one family right here, but you've also got the Laniidae and the Platylophidae, the shrikes and the jay shrikes. Crested jay shrike, I believe, is the only species in that family. The Melamphididae, which have no really common name. Their common name is Melamphidas. The Corcoracidae, which I believe are the alpine choughs. And then the Dicruidae, the drongos. And all the way back here, the earliest split are, again, around 19 million years ago. This is the Rhipidiridae. So Rhipidiridae is the family that includes fantails. And fantails, my first exposure to fantails came from the David Attenborough documentary, The Life of Birds, where they have one segment discussing the extinction of some of the native birds on Guam. Some of those birds were fantails, and it's a pretty famous story in conservation or extinction history. The introduction of the brown rat snake from ships onto Guam spelled the end of the native birds on that island because they had no, evolutionary reason to care about a snake slithering ever closer to them. But the fantails, like this guy at the top right here, are their own pretty unique group of birds that, a lot of birders know on their own, but what you might not know is that they are basal most. They are sort of approximating with the common ancestor of all these other birds, everything from a bird of paradise to, a loggerhead shrike to, a fork-tailed drongo is variations on what the fantails began. And I picked this species in particular. I think this is called drongo fantail because it really shows sort of the affinity with the body plan and the appearance of the drongos over here. So all of these species, all of these families include species that look nothing like crows. Look no further than the Paradiseidae, the birds of paradise, to see a whole range of birds that, have invented the freakiest, most elaborate display structures that, you can find in pretty much any bird. And yet they do contain members that look for all the world like a variation on the crow, just like that, that image shows here. All these other species, one kind of curiosity that I found in this phylogeny was that the monarchid flycatchers, the monarch flycatchers, as opposed to the tyrant flycatchers, are well within this Corvoididae group too. So an old world flycatcher has genetically and anatomically a lot more in common with a crow than it does with a new world tyrant flycatcher. So just another, instance of the pitfalls of common names. But what the genetics show is that, the body plans that we see in these more familiar groups of birds like crows and shrikes is a variation on, some of these smaller birds like we see in the fantails and the monarchs. And forget about crows and shrikes. The closest relatives in this whole group to the monarch flycatchers are, first of all, this Ephritidae, which I think, again, is a monotypic family, meaning it contains only one species, the Ephrita, and the Paradiseidae, the birds of paradise. So the birds of paradise are very closely related to sometimes rather unassuming species in the Monarchidae that you might see, floating around a park in Finland or something. Just a note about the diversification here, you can see that this is getting a lot more recent. So 19 million years ago is the earliest split, but then we go all the way down to around 14 million years ago, when the split between the shrikes and the jay shrikes took place. So you can see that they again originated in Australia, but these lineages, the fantails Rhipidiridae spread to Eurasia, the drongos spread to Eurasia and Africa, the monarch flycatchers, same deal. And these other ones, stayed in their ancestral range. But then finally, this very speciose radiation over here colonized all these other continents. So there's the stepwise progression that each one of these lineages took to occupy the distribution that it has today. I don't know if you all find it as valuable as I do to get these little gems of insight into the family relationships of birds, because it lets you say things like, well, a shrike is really just a small and weird looking crow. They are descended from the same genetic stock, the same common ancestor as crows, and they can trace their lineage pretty closely back to that common ancestor. And so the shrikes, although they look like other songbirds that we see around, like, maybe some without the bill, obviously, you could be forgiven for mistaking them, for warblers or even finches or tanagers just based on their body shape alone. But suddenly, when you put them in the context of this ecological, or I mean, this evolutionary radiation that includes their, closest relatives, the crows, suddenly their weird predatory habits aren't so weird anymore. They start to make a little bit more sense when you think about it from the perspective of them having descended from, these large, intelligent, corvids that have their own, sort of way of getting prey and are maybe a little bit more given to, being predatory than something like a finch or a warbler. Obviously, the crows that are around today, derived their, body plan that we see them have today, after a lot of refinement over evolutionary time. But it's a pretty safe guess to say that the common ancestor of crows and shrikes looked something intermediate between those two. In many of these families, across all these different groups, but especially within the Passerides, there are members of each of the groups that kind of give away the affinities of what their close relatives are. Now, I don't have any examples of this on this slide, but as we go through the phylogenies, we'll start to pick those out. For example, some of the closest or some of the earliest branching members of, the warblers look a little bit like tanagers, and the tanagers look a little bit like finches, and it's because they all share a very close evolutionary history. Maybe a good example of one that I already went through was that fantail. That drongo fantail is one of the earliest branches of that fantail family, and you can see that they're carrying a little bit more over of their evolutionary inheritance from their close relatives, which over evolutionary time come to look nothing like them. Okay, so we just did corvides and we looked at all the main groups within that. Now let's do passerides. So again, surprise, surprise, origin in Australia. And there is a lot of diversification that goes on in Australia before they spread to other continents. But by the time you reach the ends of the tips of these branches, you see that they have a global distribution. So over here we've got a rail babbler. This is a kokako from New Zealand. This guy is one of the muscicapid flycatchers. Great big oropendola down here, which is I'll talk more once we get to that group. And then this guy over here is a satin bird, which was a strange family of birds that I did not know existed until I made this presentation. So the satin birds actually are the first branch to come off of the lineage that would, go on to produce such familiar birds as the Sylviid warblers and their allies, the laughing thrushes, the true thrushes and their relatives, the Muscicapida, and the sparrows and relatives, the Passerida. So this is where it starts to get really, I think, relatable and relevant to us as birders in California, because most of the species that we have here fall into one of these three groups: the Passerida, the Muscicapida. We don't really have Sylviids, with a couple exceptions, looking at bush tits. But the satin birds around 30 million years ago. Now, because we're on a separate branch of the tree, we're not on the corvides anymore, we're going back in time. So these splits are happening concurrently with the splits that took place in those other groups that we already went through. So the satin birds were the first to branch off around 30 million years ago in Australia. Then came the berry peckers and longbills, the Melanochoridae. This is just one family. Here's a slaty-chinned longbill, Toxorhamphus polyapterus, from Australia. We've got the wattlebirds and their relatives. So I tried to pick, in representing these different lineages, birds that came from familiar lineages but didn't look like the birds that we're familiar with, the representatives of those lineages that we are familiar with, while also trying to give you a sense of the diversity within that. So instead of just giving you, the bird that you might intuitively already associate with this group, the wattlebirds and relatives, which is that New Zealand kokako over here, I put this stitch bird, Nodiomystis cincta, from the southern Pacific region, Australia and New Zealand, and it shows that this kind of unique morphology that we see in the kokako here is a derived state. Now, that's, again, one of the most valuable insights that you can take from studying phylogeny like this, is understanding, okay, you've got diversity, you've got anatomical diversity, you've got behavioral diversity, you've got vocal diversity, all sorts of diversity, genetic diversity. But anatomical, behavioral, vocal, those kinds of breeding systems, those are the kinds of diversity that we can easily see and observe with the naked eye. And without a framework like this that links all these different families together and all these different lineages, it can be sort of dizzying trying to hold together what seem to be unrelated facts that you're memorizing about each one of these lineages. But just in the process of making this presentation, I had some breakthroughs in understanding why certain groups of birds look the way that they look. And I think the best example of that is the sparrows and their relatives, the Passerida, but we're still a couple lineages away from that. So I brought that up with the wattlebirds and relatives because it shows that everything around the wattlebirds and their relatives is kind of long billed, skinny build, normal passerine head looking. But then you've got this one member which has got this strange anatomy over here. So it's likely that this is an evolutionary innovation. It's a step taken forward from the, or I guess outward from the original ancestral phenotype. Okay, rail babbler and its relatives. Eupetidae is the family that includes this Malaysian rail babbler. This is a strange group of birds to me. They, as you can see in this top right image here, have these sacs on their neck that they inflate. And it's easy for us as birders to kind of think about birds in terms of the groups that we have around us. This thing, the rail babbler, is not a mockingbird. It's not a warbler. It's not even very closely related to any of those. It's in its own total separate group. But with all of those weirdos out of the way, we can start to look at some of the more familiar ones. Okay, the first group that we're going to look at branched off from the others around 27 million years ago. And those are the Sylviid warblers and their relatives. So this is one of the breakthroughs that I had in making this presentation, was understanding that what we call an old world warbler, think of all the samey looking little brown jobs, or how many dozens of species of greenish warbler with pale supercilium there are in the old world. All of those similar looking birds are actually split pretty far apart in the Sylviida group. So they are all within this clade here, Sylviida, but they're separated by taxa that look really strange and different. So, the chiffchaff and the I think it's a willow warbler is the other one. In England they call these Sylviid warblers, not our parulid warblers. But the chiffchaff and that willow warbler, which are famous for being nigh impossible to distinguish without sound, are from different branches of the family tree. And they are actually pretty closely related to this silver-eared messia, which is a laughing thrush. Okay, looking at Sylvia more in depth. This group includes some of the birds that we're familiar with. They originated in Eurasia, and they include such families as the larks up here, Alaudidae. This is a thick-billed lark. The parids, the chickadees and their relatives. And then the swallows over here, and all these other unique families of birds, which thankfully I put their names all in this. So the earliest split, the origin of the group took place more or less 27 million years ago. And the first group to branch off was this Hyleotas and relatives. So yellow-bellied Hyleota is the one that I chose to represent the group here, and they are restricted only to Africa. So their origin in Eurasia belies this dispersal event to Africa. So they did spread to Africa, and from there, experienced most of their diversification. So they're descended from birds that, lived in Eurasia, but then they came to really diversify in Africa. So maybe it's arguable you could say the origin of the true, group was in Africa itself. And then the next group to branch off from all of these are the chickadees and their relatives. So the chickadees, as far as our local birds go, are way on a far-flung branch of this passerine group, and they share much more in common with all these other birds that are found in the old world than they do with the other birds that they associate with here in California. This guy up here is a sultan tit, Melanochlora sultania. And they are found on every continent except Australia and South America. I didn't include Antarctica in any of these maps because I didn't include it. Maybe there are some passerines in Australia. I mean, in Antarctica. But as far as I know, it's just snowy sheathbills milling around down there. But 26 million years ago, the first chickadees took flight, and 2 million years later, we got the first larks. So this yellow bar here represents an origin in Eurasia. So they spread from Africa to Eurasia, and then from Eurasia spread to all these other places, North and Northern South America, and then Australia and surrounding areas down here. So I like making these comparisons, like among our local birds, the closest living relatives of the chickadees are the swallows and the bush tits and the horned lark. So after the lark split over here around 24 million years ago, we've got this Nicator. They're just one family, Nicatoridae, and they're only found in Africa. A lot of the pictures on Birds of the World for these species are just birds in the hand because they're so elusive. And it takes, a mist net to get really up close to them. But next we've got the African warblers, Macrosphaenidae. This is a mustached grass warbler. Again, 23 million years ago, we've got the cisticolas splitting off. This is a white-browed tailor bird, and the cisticolas are all of the old world, but the African warblers, as the name implies, are just Africa. Next split that we have here, okay, now we're getting into superfamilies. So with the exception of the swallows and their relatives, which do not constitute a superfamily, I'll talk about them first before we get to the main groups. So just like in the corvides, we had those three superfamilies, the Malaconotoideae, the Orioloideae, and the Corvoideae. This is the hierarchical equivalent of that, just on a separate branch. So they are just as closely related to one another as those corvoid or those corvide superfamilies are. So before we get into those, we'll just talk a little bit about the swallows and their relatives. I don't have all the families that are related to swallows here, but they are closely related to some other families in this radiation. This is an African river martin, and they are found all over. Oh yeah, I was gonna say there are definitely swallows in Australia. I'm reading the chart wrong. They're found worldwide. But what we have over here are some of the subfamilies. So we've got the Agathalloideae, and you might recognize that Agathallo from, well, I guess I'm just recognizing it from this. I was going to say from bush tit, but no, it's Saltriparis minimus. This is a chestnut-capped flycatcher, Erythrocircus macaulay from one of the earliest branches of that group. But this is the group that includes bush tits. So if you've ever been on a bird walk and you've heard somebody say that bush tits, are representatives of a largely old world clade, this is what they're talking about. They are well within this Sylviida radiation, and most of their relatives are found in the old world. So we've got three subfamilies: the Agathalloideae, the Sylvioideae, and then over here the Locustelloideae. Now, Locustelloideae is notorious for being chock full of those indistinguishable greenish warblers. I think one of them is actually called greenish warbler. That might be a different group of old world warblers, but they all kind of look like lowercase g, greenish, lowercase w warblers. With the exception of this black-capped Donacobius, which is, as far as I know, the only representative of that superfamily in South America. And it just looks so strange and divergent from the other ones. So it's cool to see what these lineages can do when they find themselves in new circumstances. So the Sylvioideae over here, these are the Sylviid warblers and their relatives, and they include like the old world babblers. So, these are birds that are hopping around in the desert sand of Egypt and northern Africa. But they also include some familiar species. Okay, we're going to pick the first subfamily to look at more in depth, Locustelloideae. They originated in Africa, and here you can see one of the key groups of this radiation is the top left here. This is one of the acrocephalous warblers. So, I have never had it in me to keep track of all the old world warblers that show up like at, I don't know, Bonelli or some of these other places that are in Los Angeles County. Let's just call it Los Angeles County. But I'm sure that they are coming from either this subfamily or one of the related subfamilies. But they're not each other's closest relatives, even though they look really similar. But the acrocephalous warblers are within this Locustelloideae subfamily. Within it, we've got Acrocephalidae, Locustellidae, and I picked the most interesting looking member of Locustellidae. And then Donacobiidae over here is sister to Bernieridae, and these Bernieridae are called Malagasy Malagasy warblers. So strange. How did this, divergence happen when you have this one lineage originating in Africa, as shown by the green lines there, but then subsequently dispersing to North and South America, represented by this Donacobiidae. I guess they can be found both in that blue area and the purple area within South America. Or the Caribbean. I think they actually are Caribbean species. I took these geographical delineations straight from the Oliveros et al. 2019 paper, Earth History and the Passerine Super Radiation. They are my own drawings, but I traced over a map and filled in where the borders were that they used in their study. Okay. back to the main Sylviidae group. We're going to look at this Agathalloideae. So these guys originated in Africa, and here again you can play that game of noticing family resemblance. The Agathalloidea includes the relatives of bush tits, and you can kind of see this guy down here looks like a bush tit. Regretfully, I don't have the name of these birds on the slides, but if we split up their phylogeny, we can see here all the different families. So Phylloscopidae, so Phylloscopus, antepenultimate. Phylloscopidae is the first branch to come off of this group around 20 million years ago. And they originated in Africa and spread to Eurasia and Australia. And then the Hyliidae was the next one to split. And then here are our bush tits, Agathallidae. That's why it sounded familiar, because it's the family name. So Agathallidae originated in the Old World in Eurasia and then subsequently spread to North America. And then finally down here, we've got Scotocercidae and Erythrocercidae. And these are called, their common names include things like flycatchers. So again, pitfalls of common names. They do not refer to distinct monophyletic groups. Okay. Next, we've got the Sylvioid superfamily, Sylvioideae. So they originated in Africa as well. And here they include things like the laughing thrushes, I clicked the wrong button. The bulbuls are part of this group, and the Sylviid warblers and Zosteropidae, the white-eyes, Timaliidae, the babblers, Laeothrichidae, those are the laughing thrushes, and then Pelorneidae, the sister group to these laughing thrushes. So again, here's the practical implications. White eyes, like, Swinhoe's white eye that you see around the LA River or something, is pretty closely related to red-whiskered bulbul. Neither of those two species are native to here. They are all old world radiations. They originated in Africa and then spread to Eurasia and Australia. And then here they diversified again in Eurasia and spread to North America. And then over here, the Zosteropidae, that's the white eyes, and Eugenias. Some of the endemic birds of Taiwan are called Eugenias, and they're in the same family. That's the Zosteropidae. They're exclusively Old World. And then you've got the babblers, the Timaliidae, which are over here in Eurasia. They're like in Northern Africa, Central Asia. And then you've got the laughing thrushes and the Pelorneidae, which are, again, only in the Old World. So a red-whiskered bulbul is pretty closely related to, a red-billed Leothrix that you might have seen as a guest in Hawaii. Okay. We're going to go all the way back out because we did all the subfamilies within Sylviidae. So now we're going to go Muscicapida. All right. So this clade originated in Eurasia, and it includes such familiar birds as kinglets, the wall creeper on the bottom left here, and the Muscicapid flycatchers, the old world another family of old world flycatchers. Down here is a photo that I took of a silky flycatcher in Costa Rica, and this group, the Taliogonatidae, is the group that includes our Phainopepla. So here are the splits. We've got 1, 2, 3 superfamilies and 1 standalone family, the kinglets. So again, now we're starting to be able to piece together the relationships between some of the birds that we see every day. So the first superfamily is the Bombyciloidea. These are the waxwings and their relatives. The next one is Muscicapoidea, mockingbirds and their relatives. Then we've got kinglets as sister to nuthatches and their relatives. So we're going from Eurasia to North America and Australia over here. Cedar waxwing is part of this group, Bombyciloidea. And then we've got Eurasia to global distribution here, the mockingbirds and their relatives, and then the Certhioids never quite made it to Australia, I guess. And then kinglets are what we have. They have what we call a whole Arctic distribution, meaning that they're in Eurasia and North America in the northern hemisphere, nowhere in the southern hemisphere. Okay. Looking at the Bombacilloidea, we've got an origin in North America, and this includes birds like the waxwing up here. I think this might be a Japanese waxwing, or I think this is Bohemian waxwing. Correct me if I'm wrong in the chat. This guy right here is the palm chat in the family Dulidae. This is one of the silky flycatchers. This is a strange bird called a hypocoleus, and this is a Hylocytrea. Now, this guy right here is a very famous bird. This is the Kauai oo. And the Kauai oo is nested well within the family, or the superfamily that includes birds like Phainopeplas and waxwings, and then all these other palmchat and hypocoleus and Hylocytrea over here. So the thinking is that, you know, these birds were ancestrally North American, and that some relative from one of these groups, probably closest to Hypocoleidae, so maybe from Eurasia, came and spread down to Hawaii. So this Mohoidae represents an insular radiation within that this overall superfamily that took place in Hawaii. Regrettably, they are all now extinct, but they did not go extinct so long ago to prevent people from having photographed them. So we have that nice picture. Okay, so again, family resemblances. You can kind of see some of the similarities between Phainopepla and cedar waxwing if you look at it hard enough with this context in mind. All right. Now, the second superfamily in Muscicapida, that's the mockingbirds and their relatives. So mockingbirds, they and their relatives originated in Eurasia. And this is a really cool radiation of birds because it groups together some birds that, when you think about it, really seem like they do fit together. I picked this this bird right here. Again, suffering from not having put the names of the birds on this. This is a member of Sternidae, the starling family. But seeing as that Sternidae is sister to Mimedae, you can kind of see the similarities between this bird right here, which is a relative of the European starling and the mynas, showing some resemblance to something like a thrasher, which is in the Mimedae. So all of these other birds, one up here is a thrush. We've got an oxpecker. This one is in the family Elecuridae. This is a wren. I think this is, or I mean, sorry, a mimid. This is a mockingbird. See, it's even easy to confuse some of these. This is an ocellated thrasher. And then we've got a dipper over here and one of the Muscicapid flycatchers on that bottom left there. Okay, so let's split it up. This group had an entirely Eurasian origin for all the lineages, but subsequently came to occupy, you know, different continents. You've got the Elecuridae as the first branch around 24.5 million years ago in Eurasia. They're still restricted to Eurasia. Now, the next branch to come off of this is Cinclidae, and the Cinclidae are the dippers. So dippers, as far as birds go, are very closely related to mockingbirds and starlings, and thrushes for that matter. So the thrushes over here are sister to the old world Muscicapid flycatchers. And again, you can kind of see some of that family resemblance, how one is a variation on the theme of the other. Now, the next split is between these oxpeckers and the mimids and sternids. So the oxpecker is the closest living relative of, well, both species of oxpecker, this red-billed and yellow-billed, this is a yellow-billed, are the closest relatives of mockingbirds and starlings put together. So it's this kind of grouping that sort of lets you broaden your perspective on what constitutes a family of birds, or what constitutes an evolutionary grouping of birds. Now, whenever I go out, I'm never going to be able to unsee the similarities between mockingbirds and starlings. And to me, you know, they're all one evolutionary unit now. Like, they have different names for different families, but they do represent a cohesive evolutionary unit. So they are all variations on each other's themes, as I have said ad nauseum at this point. Okay. Next group is Certhioideae. And sorry, kinglets, we're going to skip you because there's no further splits to make in your lineage. You're just kinglets. And you are sister to the Certhioideae, which includes the nuthatches and their relatives. So We've got a wall creeper. We've got a member of the gnatcatcher family over here. And this is the group that includes gnatcatchers, wrens, nuthatches, and the wall creeper. And also the creepers too, like a brown creeper. Origin in Eurasia, spread everywhere but Australia. Okay. So Tychodromidae, the wall creeper, one species, one family, is the first branch to come off of the Certhioidea around 23 million years ago, and they're found in Eurasia. But the rest of this group includes Sitidae, the nuthatches, Salpornithidae, which are the spotted creepers, Certhiidae, which are our creepers, and then over here, Troglodytidae and Polyoptilidae. So wrens and gnatcatchers are each other's closest relatives. Now, if anyone has ever confused the sound of a Bewick's wren with the sound of a California gnatcatcher, that is not just pure coincidence. They do share some they do have some shared ancestry that perhaps comes through in their vocal behavior. So there are some cool transitional species, and this is what I was talking about earlier. I think it's rufous-cheeked gnat wren. I could be wrong in that common name. But this little member of the gnatcatcher family, Polyoptilidae, shows a pretty intermediate appearance, morphology between the wrens and the gnatcatchers. So again, just like, I will never be able to unsee the similarities between starlings and mockingbirds. Now suddenly the same is true for wrens and gnatcatchers. They are just mirrors of each other, having, been exposed to different selective pressures, but they are very, very close as birds go. And same goes with this entire group, wrens, gnatcatchers, creepers, and nuthatches, plus these other two families that we don't have represented in North America. There is a lot of similarity between them. And if nothing else, it's helpful to start getting you trained in the habit of thinking cladistically, thinking in terms of groups of evolutionary units, monophyletic groups, and the similarities or differences thereof. And once you understand that topology, then you can understand the number of times that a certain feature evolved, whether it's a result of convergent evolution or whether it's a result of shared ancestry, whether it's passed down or innovated in a certain lineage, maybe more than once. Okay. Now, for the very last group clade on our tour here, these are the sparrows and their relatives, the Passeridae, as evidenced by this nice stripe-headed sparrow. Represented by, not evidenced by. Okay. So Passeridae originated in Eurasia, and it's got all of these really, really familiar birds. We've got the olive warbler up on the top right here. We've got a painted redstart. We've got one of the finches, the fringillids. We've got one of the old world sparrows, the Passeridae. We've got the Motacillidae, the wagtails. We've got the Promyropidae, the sugarbirds, the sunbirds, Nectarinidae, the Astrildid finches, these leaf birds. This one bird called, I believe it's pronounced Przewalski's pinktail, as in Przewalski's horse, the only, or I think the only surviving wild non-domesticated horse in Eurasia. Side note. And then finally, the accenters and their relatives. Okay. So this is a huge radiation of birds, and it includes all these very finch-like and warbler-like birds at the very tip here. But before we get to that, things like our lesser goldfinches and yellow-rumped warblers and house sparrows and the zebra finches, in your brother's living room, they are all derived from a bird that look, maybe closer to what this Gurney's sugar bird looked like, this Promyropidae. So the sugar birds and the sunbirds clearly show similarities. Again, evidence that they are drawing from a common genetic stock, that they didn't just both independently arrive on this morphology, that they're inheriting it from their ancestors. And then the next branch split off around 23 million years ago, or the fairy bluebirds and relatives. I always remember these being a highlight of, often zoos have aviary collections that include fairy bluebirds, and it seemed like something so far off and distant, as far as the world of birds went. But who knew? They're actually pretty closely related to some very, very familiar birds. Here's an olive warbler, which is the next branch to split off. Now, the olive warbler previously was classified way over here in the New World warblers and relatives superfamily, the Emberizoidea. But with genetic sequencing, they found that it is a highly divergent and strange-looking member of a group that is actually way back here in the evolutionary history, split off from, the lineage that would eventually lead to New World warblers, which were only derived some 18 million years ago, around 22 million years ago. And they're found, I think, in the Caribbean region. So next to split off is the Przewalski's pinktail. I know absolutely nothing about this bird. I didn't know it existed before this presentation. And then next, we've got a lineage that includes these waxbills and their relatives. The family is Strilidae, and Ploseidae. So a familiar representative of this clade right here is, well, first of all, the zebrafinch, but also the pin-tailed whydah. The pin-tailed whydah is in the family Viduidae, and they are brood parasites of the Astrilidae, which are another family in the same little radiation here, the waxbills and relatives. So I believe the Old World or the African weaver birds are part of this group too, but I could be wrong about that. I don't think I'm wrong, but I could be. Okay, next we've got the accentors, the Prunellidae, and these split off around 21 million years ago. The Prunellidae does not have any representatives in North America, at least not counting weird vagrants that show up on Onto or something. And then next we've got the Old World sparrows, Passeridae. This is a plain-backed sparrow, split off around 19 million years ago. Clearly, this is where our house sparrow comes from. And then finally, we've got, oh wait, not quite finally. Almost finally, we have this family here, the Motacillidae, the wagtails and pipits, like our American pipit. And I fun to say pipit. And then next is the split between the New World warblers and their relatives, which are a superfamily, the Emberizoideae, and the family Fringillidae, which includes the finches. So this is one of my favorite groups of birds, the finches and their closest relatives. These, I believe, are the birds that are by and large referred to as the New World 9 primaried Oscines. So, that was a term that probably came about in previous classifications that were based on morphology, or who knows, it's useful in like a pile guide or something. I haven't vetted that, but I do think that that's the name that corresponds to this group, is the New World 9 primaried Oscines, meaning they have 9 flight feathers coming out of their hand. Okay, and the reason these are some of my favorite lineages to look at here are because the reason is because you can start to see the similarities between a lot of ostensibly different groups of birds. So a sparrow, a New World sparrow, that is, a finch, a New World finch, a cardinal, like our Western tanager, and a tanager are actually pretty closely related. And again, thinking in terms of evolutionary units, these are all one unit. They are all variations on a single theme that is, more self-similar than it is to any other theme outside of itself. And they are all inheriting certain features that kind of give them similar looks. A perfect example of this is grosbeaks. What we think of as grosbeaks are actually represented by, 2 or 3 different families. There are birds called grosbeaks in the Cardinalidae over here. There are birds called grosbeaks in the Thraupidae. There are birds called grosbeaks in the Passarellidae. I think those 3 are the only ones that I can think of. But they are all examples of convergent evolution, yes, on the one hand, but from shared anatomical equipment, so to speak. All of these birds have vaguely triangular faces. They are the seed eaters and the ground hoppers and the, eating crumbs out from under the table kind of birds. They, that, I guess that kind of sells them a little bit short, because they do have, lots of very, very highly specialized relationship to their actual environment besides just crumbs. But human crumbs are part of the environment too. In any case, they're using these triangular beaks to crush seeds. And the warblers over here, which their closest relatives are the blackbirds, kind of represent a specialization towards insectivory. So they, instead of, they descended from largely seed-eating ancestors, and then evolved independently this, small beak that's great for, gleaning insects off of foliage like that. So just to give a rundown of the families that we have here, we've got the Rhodinocyclidae. I think this is called a rosy thrush tanager. Around 15.5 million years ago, that split. So now pay attention to these times. This is a really recent radiation of birds. Now, if I consult my little chart here, 15.5 million years ago is, again, in the Miocene. So this is 2 epochs away from the Holocene where we are now. So this is getting really, really recent. 15.5 million years ago is the oldest divergence, but 9 million years ago is the most recent one. So Icteriidae and Icteriidae, the yellow-breasted chat and the blackbirds, the New World blackbirds, not the thrush that gets called a blackbird in the Old World. They are the most recent split to have taken place around here at around 9 million years. And forgive me, earlier I said that the sister group to New World warblers was the blackbirds, but it's actually a combination, a clade that includes both the blackbirds and the yellow-breasted chat, which previously had been lumped into Parulidae or Icteridae. It was considered either a warbler or a blackbird, but genetic evidence is borne out that it's neither. So here we've got the first split leads us to Calcareidae and Emberizidae. So they are the old world buntings over here and the long spurs. And then we've got a clade that includes Cardinalidae, Mitrospingidae, and Thraupidae. So the New World tanagers and the cardinals are very, very closely related, even within the superfamily. Next, you've got the Passerellidae, the New World sparrows, one of my personal favorite families of birds. Just because their patterns and markings are so bold and beautiful. The Passerellidae is sister to a group that includes all these other things. And, key example of this kind of intermediate phenotype, intermediate morphology is the Spindalis. If you didn't know the word Spindalis and you didn't have the family Spindalidae, at your disposal to describe this bird, if you looked at that, Western Spindalis right here, I think this is a Puerto Rican Spindalis. If you looked at this, whoops, Puerto Rican Spindalis there. Well, surprise, this is my last slide. Without knowing any of, of its actual affinities, would you call that a sparrow or a finch or a tanager or a cardinal? The same goes for all these other birds. Just to close things out, I will go over Calyptophylidae, around 12 million years ago. Split off from this group that includes Zeladoniidae and then Phaenicophylidae. I think these are called chat tanagers, and then Spindalidae and Nisospingidae. That's a monotypic family that includes one species. But I want to leave you with that idea about the Spindalis. I mean, if you had to look at a Spindalis and classify it without, having all this framework to understand things, would you call it a tanager or a finch or a sparrow? And the fact that it's so hard to pick any one of these that it looks more closely related to than not is evidence of just how much shared commonality all these lineages have, and just how far and what interesting ways they can take it in all these different directions that they're speciating in when they're moving into new environments. I also think that it's just mind-blowing that warblers are so closely related to, the New World blackbirds, the icterids, which include, oropendulas and troupials like this Venezuelan troupial. With all that being said, this brings me to the end of my presentation. My works cited slide is not displaying the works cited, but the work that I did cite is Oliveros et al. 2019, the Earth History and the Passerine Superradiation. Only after I had spent a significant amount of time working on this did I discover that there is a book, a comprehensive history of the biogeography and evolutionary history of the passerines by Lynx Editions. So I will have to go check that out. But I hope that you all learned something from this. I hope that you weren't all bored to tears by listening to me talk about all these delineations between families of perching birds. Thank you all for your time, and I guess we can open it to questions now.
Yeah, that was
Yes.
a mega webinar. Thank you, Diego. That was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you so
Okay,
much.
Of course. Is anyone still here?
Yes,
yeah,
yes, we have
actually,
Okay,
a lot of people
fantastic.
still here.
a
Excellent.
lot of people have stuck around. That was absolutely wonderful, and it
Yeah.
didn't get exciting till the last few slides.
I know. That's how I feel too.
So for
I
people
love.
who want to put in questions, go to the Q&A, please,
Yes.
and put your questions there.
Shall I stop sharing? I think it might make it easier for me to see the questions.
Well, I'm going to read the questions
Oh,
anyway because
excellent.
people on YouTube can't see the little thing that comes out.
That's
So,
right. That's right. Okay, I'll leave it
and
here
if you
then.
keep sharing, you might be able to, jump back
Yeah.
and forth between slides and
Excellent.
stuff.
Cool.
Yeah. Also, on the recording, I'm not sure if the questions actually pop up.
I don't think
So,
so.
yeah.
Thanks, Diego. That was great.
Thank you, Frank.
But Diego, I'm afraid that you might have left everyone pretty stunned. Um,
I think it is a helpful thing to provide the names for all of these birds that I
yes.
pictured in the presentation. So if you are curious about anything that you saw in this, or if anybody's watching this in the distant future when we have all gone extinct and this is on a hard drive somewhere out in the Leo cluster, then email me. I'll send you all the references.
No, it actually helped kind of make clearer in my mind things like spinalidae. I just why where the well it anyways, I'm not
Yes, I've
sure.
always thought of them as tanagers because they've just been called tanagers.
Yeah,
Right? It's
Just because somebody
there's
says, yeah, people give it that name, right?
right.
there's so many mix-ups that happened when people were doing the classifications purely on morphology, because when you're doing it that way there's so many convergences, there's so many shared traits, there's all this stuff that confounds your ability to separate things into nice categories. And so
Right,
why not call spindalis a tanager? Why not call western tanager a tanager when it's actually a cardinal? But in the end it turns out cardinals are pretty close to tanagers anyway.
right. Or New World Orioles versus Old World Orioles, which
Yeah, old world
look kind
Oriole.
of similar, but they're
Yeah, they look
very
similar,
different.
but old
Yeah,
world Orioles are weird vireos. They're much closer to vireos than they are to our Orioles, which are like weird warblers. It's
yeah,
a total trip for sure.
yeah. So we have a question from the live stream. Harnawaz asks, out of curiosity, any ideas what
That
could have
popped up.
triggered?
Before you head over there, I think there might be a question or two.
I'm sorry, I
What was
couldn't
that?
hear that.
It blocked out. Can you repeat that?
Oh, from the live stream, Harnawaz asked, out of curiosity, any ideas what could have triggered these birds to disperse from Australia originally?
I think it's just vicarious. I mean, I think that they're, looking for new environments. It's possible that some of them were blown around on the ocean, but they were, expanding in population and they wanted to, get to new places. And so I think, just over time, this is millions and millions of years. Birds got to fly somewhere, and pretty soon all the territories are taken up on Australia. You got to go,
Yeah.
take a hike. Hello, Harnawaz. Thanks for watching. Harnawaz is one of the volunteers at the Moore Lab.
All
Oh,
right.
okay, great. Bob asks, is Vegavis, the thing they have from Australia, a true bird?
Yes, it is a true bird. It is related to the Gallo-Anceres. I think it's actually well within the water bird clade. So I think it's the waterfowl clade. Yes, Vegavis is I'm pretty sure Vegavis is a Cretaceous bird. But it was not one of the enantiorniths or one of the non-true birds. It was like set and square, true modern bird. In fact, within like I think the Anseriforms, so maybe just sister to Anseriforms, but definitely within Gallo-Anceres. And so yes, a modern bird, true bird.
Wonderful. Thank you. Carol asks, what's your thoughts for the future? Do you think divergence will still continue, or is the environment not changing enough to cause more genetic selection?
I think the environment is changing rapidly. I think in the next, 10,000 years, we're going to have house sparrows strutting around like that Gastornis at the beginning. Maybe more than 10,000 years. But yes, I think if anything has
Giant
been
house
borne out
sparrows.
by the last 12,000 years is that the environment is changing much faster than it's ever, changed in
Yeah.
this span of time. So,
Yeah.
you know,
I like to see the French fries the giant house sparrows are.
yeah, I'm looking at two of them right now.
Oh boy.
Perhaps on a more serious note to answer that question, I think, I've heard a lot about drying trends. There is, lots of evidence that says, that the Arctic regions are going to become a little bit more temperate in climate. So perhaps, that's going to be new areas. Maybe that we'll have another Antarctica, but, it'll be Arctica instead.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see. Bob says something about they say it was from prior to the meteorite. Is that the
Vegavis was prior to the
Vegavis?
meteorite. Yes,
Okay.
and it is from Antarctica, not Australia. Thank you for those two
It is from
clarifications, Bob.
Antarctica. Okay.
Yeah. It was from the Cretaceous period, so yes, prior to the meteorite, but
Prior to
still
the
a
meteorite.
true bird.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
Cool.
Lily asks, were there extinctions triggered by the climate cooling, and would that have left niches open for these passerines to fill?
Okay, two things on that. The first is that the paper that I referenced for this presentation made it very clear that there was not a link between climatic changes per se and bird diversification, increases in the rate of diversification of birds. That previously lots of authors had considered that to be one of the driving forces, but that what their analysis found was that the increases in the diversification rate were not tied to huge changes in global climate like that, even with that huge hot to cold trend that you have in the Eocene. But that's not to say that those global changes did not impact the specific, trajectories that certain lineages within the overall radiation took. I guarantee you that they did. It absolutely changed the fate of one lineage of passerine birds, that it was, hotter and drier, and suddenly you had a conifer forest, now it's all thorny legumes. That did impact, the path that different lineages took to evolve, but not, as far as we can tell, the overall rate of diversification or extinction, as the flip side of that.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank
Cool.
you.
But that's not. I'm not the end all be all on this. I am presenting something that I gleaned from reading, and so I absolutely encourage you to do more research. And it's very possible that actually there are definitely things that I left out, with respect to Earth history and the way that geologic events or certain things impacted extinctions and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Great. I think
Any more questions?
I know. I think we're out of questions. I can't get rid of
Oh,
that.
I see a question in the chat. What proportion of the analysis on which this taxonomy is based is with whole genome sequencing? Could there be big surprises ahead with whole genomic analysis?
I actually don't remember. I think they were using like UCEs, but I could be wrong about that. I don't remember the exact protocol that this study used. I think some of it was whole genome, maybe, I won't speculate, but I actually don't remember, truth be told. Who knows? There could be lots more surprises. I think that a lot of the genetic work to be done on this group probably entails like splitting what we consider to be one species into like two populations. And you can split hairs all the way down to the root, but it just refers to the fact that you've got distinct systems within a population. Like this is a unit, they're behaving as a discrete entity that might form and dissolve and relate to other things here and there. So I'm all for identifying the splits, no matter how trivial they might seem.
Mhm.
Cool. And I think we had another.
Another question from Lynette. Aside to keeping up to date on relevant literature, do you recommend any specific works or resources to learn more about the evolutionary history of birds?
Well, I'm making a secondhand recommendation of this book that I became aware of from Lynx Editions yesterday morning. Um,
Yeah.
I actually forget what it's called, but it's almost straight up like the title of this talk. It's like Biogeography and Evolutionary History of the Largest Avian Radiation. I think it's like by Dan Paris, something like Zeska. Uh, so for passerines, I would point you there. For specific works or resources to learn more about the evolutionary history of birds in general, I always use Birds of the World, but I understand that that's a subscription. I, as much as I adore iNaturalist, they are severely lacking in their ranked taxonomy when it comes to different orders and all that stuff. But that's not a bad place to start. It's definitely like good to get your bearings there. Um, I am an abiding fan of the often uh, disparaged Wikipedia because they when they cite their references, yes, someone in good faith often puts a comment on Wikipedia and then cites it. So don't cite Wikipedia as a source, but you can use it as like a roundup. People will put sources there that you can then go click on and then read about on your own. That I think that's how I found this paper to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess you said aside from keeping up to date on relevant literature, I don't know. That Passerine book is the best one that I can think of for now.
Yeah, I'm on the Lynx side and I'm not finding it at the moment.
Maybe
Maybe
this was a
it's
fever dream. Maybe I had a vision 10
no, it
years in
might
the
have gone out of print.
future.
I
No,
maybe
I think it's either Princeton University Press or Lynx Editions. I'm
okay.
not
I'm on
100%.
Lynx and I'm just not. So maybe it's Princeton. Oh well. Anyways, enough that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Bob
thanks, Carl.
Archer, I can see the questions actually. Bob Archer asked, did any variety of modern birds evolve in North America and spread out like all these Australian birds did? The North American ones that evolved in North America tended to stay in North and South America, I think, because they had already come from other places. And those other places were already occupied by all their, their relatives. So because they started in Australia and tended to like go into Eurasia first and then from Eurasia into Africa or North America, once they got to North America, I think from what I understand, the only place left to go was South America, and then that was where they diversified, and that's the case for the Tyrannids, like the Furnariids and the Ovenburs and all those other uh, tyrant flycatchers even are part of that radiation. But then also these guys too, right on the screen right here, they're North Americans spreading to South America. Like, the Parulidae originated in North America where their center of diversity is. And then like a couple genera made it to South America, like God, what are those things called? Myoborus and Basiluterus and all those other genera, which are comparatively less diverse in South America because they are more recent arrivals there.
Okay.
Lily said, did I already read this one? Were there extinctions triggered by the
Yeah,
climate
we already.
cooling? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, we already went through that one. For some reason, I can't delete it.
Some reason I can't. I
Yeah.
can't get rid of it on the thing, even though we answered
It
it.
has nothing to do with Lily.
No. It's
Maybe
just something one of us clicked on that must be weird.
Yeah, I can't get and you can. Oh well, it doesn't matter.
I can't do
Anyways,
it either.
this has been a killer of a webinar, Diego. I compliment you on your stamina.
Well, thank you, gentlemen.
I think you're getting more energetic as a webinar goes on, but yeah, it was an incredible webinar. It helped clear up a lot of things and make birds and the relative species much more clear for many of us. And thank you very much.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you guys very much. If I can
thank
leave
you.
you all with one thought,
Yes.
I designed this webinar to be pausable. This is meant to display lots of information on one slide. And if you're
Right.
watching this as a video, like I would hope that it's useful as a reference. If you just want at a glance, what are the relationships? Where are they found? You can stop the video and there you've got the information right there.
And
Wonderful.
that is
Regardless of whether I'm talking over.
no, that is a wonderful, wonderful idea. And the way it was presented, I agree. I was thinking that same thought myself. Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Yeah, and we'll have it have the recording up on the YouTube channel so that people can go back and do exactly that. Pause the video at whichever slide they want.
Yeah,
Awesome.
absolutely. I hope you can join us next month. We have a couple of great webinars coming up. In the meantime, thank you again, Diego. It was wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next webinar.
Yep.
Take care,
Thank you
everyone.
all.
Yep.
Good
See you
night.
next time. Thank you, Diego.
Bye.
Thank you, Diego. Good night, everyone.
Good night.